Triathlon Show, episode 53. Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. As always, I'm your host, Michael, and once again, I've let an interview run long, so we're going to go right to the meat and potatoes of today's episode, my interview with David Tilbury-Davis, who is the coach of, among others, professional triathletes Cody Beals and Lionel Sanders. We had a great discussion. I had so many takeaways from this and so many interesting things that I started thinking about after talking to David, including, for example, the thing that David mentions about how using paddles in swimming is not necessarily a good thing for triathletes, and the cognitive load and how that needs to be taken into account when training for three different sports. So those are just some of my nuggets, but you will have yours, and we talk about both things applicable for beginners as well as very advanced triathletes. So there's something for everybody here, and with a particular view to self-coaching as well. I'll be right back after the interview to talk a little bit about a new paper by Stephen Seiler that me and David discussed briefly in the interview. But that's after hearing from David Tilbury-Davis. All right, on today's interview on That Triathlon Show, I am with David Tilbury-Davis. David, welcome to the show.
Good morning.
Good morning for you and good evening for me. I'm in Finland and you are way beyond the Atlantic in Seattle. Is that correct?
Yes, currently in Seattle.
Yeah, okay. And can you just give the listeners a brief background of yourself as a coach?
Absolutely. I've been coaching triathlon for about 20 years now, and 2008 really made it a full-time gig for myself, so to speak. I spent about 4 or 5 years based in Spain, and then more recently have been based in the US and a couple of years in Texas, and then have just moved up to the Pacific Northwest.
Perfect. And who are some of the athletes that you coach? I think there are at least a couple of names that many of the listeners will be familiar with.
Yeah, I've been working with a mixture of professional and age group athletes all over the world for many years. And currently, my athletes are predominantly in North America and Canada. I also have an athlete in Iceland at the moment, though. In terms of some of those athletes, I work with Cody Beals, Lionel Sanders, Jim Lubinsky, Leslie Smith, Sue Hughes, to name some of the professional athletes, and a mixture of age group athletes that are racing at a variety of different world championship races.
Yeah, and we'll link to your website as well. And you have taken both the pros and the age groupers to great success in their various competitions, like World Championships and other great achievements. So that will all be linked up in the show notes. Now, you're known, at least from an outside perspective, my impression is that you take a scientific approach to training, and you like looking at numbers. Of course, that's not the only thing that you do, but that's one of the things that you have made a name for yourself with. So how does that translate to planning the training of your athletes, and how do you use that more generally?
I think it's an interesting point. You wouldn't be the first person to say that I'm sort of perceived as a quantitative coach. I think if you spoke to my athletes, they would probably argue quite differently. But it does go back to my background in business, and I really take a point of view that, in a simplistic way, if you're not measuring, you're not managing. As a cliched phrase. Now, the depth and detail as to which you measure is dependent on really what sort of outcome you're hoping for. I mean, the reality is, and I won't disagree with anybody in saying that, the true test of whether you're doing things right or wrong is a race. But the whole point of collecting data along the way is to really understand why or why not you're progressing, and thereby you could learn as a coach and you can learn as an athlete. So whether it's something as simplistic as a perception of effort that you keep a record of from a training session, or whether it's some highly technologically advanced running power meter that attaches to your shoes and you're looking at vertical oscillation, then they're both just ways of measuring and having information that allows you to then ask better questions.
Yeah, and can you go into a bit more specifics here on how you measure and what the timelines are? Do you have like periodic tests, or do you look for certain developments on certain things that you follow, like those RPEs from key sessions, or how do you do that?
It depends on the athlete. In most instances, we'll sit down at the beginning of the year and we'll look back at the previous year and look at what went well and what could have gone better. And then we'll look at what are the goals moving forwards for the next 6 to 12 months. And then within that, lay out very clear benchmarks of, okay, well, if we're trying to win a world championship, then, we know based on experience that you're going to have to be able to run typically this run split. You're going to have to be able to bike at this kind of power output and, have a really good drag number. So, we need to work on perhaps position or equipment choices. And then from there, we say, okay, well, that's where we need to get to. Where are we now? And then, fill in the blanks and say, okay, well, we need some benchmarks along the way of progression. Are those sequential? Are those tied into certain events and races? And then, whilst I'd also potentially use some sort of fixed test, like a 20-minute test on the bike or a 4-minute test on the bike for the professional road races, or a combination of different things, or 400 and 200 in the pool, and calculating critical pace or critical power, those kinds of concepts. There's also the reality of, with 3 sports, if you're constantly testing, it can get very cognitively demanding for an athlete. If you're doing a swim, a bike, and a run test, and you're doing that, every 6 to 8 weeks, that's a lot of testing. And the reality is that training is testing and testing is training. So my experience is such that there's certain training sessions an athlete will do that I will expect a certain response. And if they're definitely progressing, then, the response is X plus Y. And, if it's not what we're expecting, it's X minus Y. So there's a combination there. I'm not as black and white as, we must do a 20-minute test every 6 weeks to validate your progression in fitness, because the reality is you can write a training program that can make somebody absolutely phenomenally brilliant at 20-minute tests, and you could rightly argue that that's a really good reflection of their aerobic fitness. But if they're training for an Ironman and the longest bike ride they ever do is 90 minutes, then I think you're setting that athlete up for failure. So I think there's some common sense in there in terms of specificity towards a race or a race environment, or the outcome, such as a certain run split or a certain power output.
Okay, so you have, depending on the athletes, let's say limitations or the goals that they need to hit, and for their specific goal race, you have those key sessions that, for example, for an Ironman athlete, and where the bike is the key issue, maybe for that particular athlete, you would look at their performance and progression in a training session like a bike workout with several long intervals, like 20-minute intervals and a whole heap of those, or something like that?
There'd definitely be a place for that, but it's even broader. I can give you a good example. I worked with one athlete who actually lives in Espoo near you.
Oh, right.
And he raced Ironman Malaysia last year and was looking to qualify for Kona again, and training in September or October and November in Finland, I'm sure has its challenges, and so we had a very large focus on heat acclimation and carefully monitoring the sort of interplay between his power output, which we knew he could put out a lot of power, but actually the relationship between that and sort of cardiovascularly what was going on, as a measure of sort of heat tolerance, and using certain heat acclimation protocols to get him ready for the race.
Okay, yeah, that's a good example. Really interesting.
So that's something that I think any age group athlete can do is sit down and very simplistically take a strength a SWOT analysis and say, okay, well, what are my physiological strengths and what are my physiological weaknesses, based on my sporting background, and how does that relate to my goals? I want to do a sprint distance triathlon. I want to do an Olympic distance triathlon. What opportunities do I have to train? Do I have a good opportunity to get a really long day of training in one day a week at the weekend, in which case I then need to start about making sure I'm fueling properly between those workouts and during those workouts so I can get the best out of those workouts. What are the threats to my training and consistency of training? So do I work shifts? Do I have poor sleep patterns? Do I work long hours? And do I have a very sort of cognitively demanding job, in which case doing any sort of really hard intervals during the week, just as a coach, just becomes just not good decision making. If you have somebody that's just, a chief executive of a company working a 16-hour day, making really tough decisions, and then you say, okay, this evening at 9:00 at night, I want you to get on your bike and do 2 by 12 minutes at sort of 90% of threshold. It's not going to happen. And there's ways around that, and both from a planning perspective and also from a putting the responsibility back on the athlete and say, okay, well, the goal for this workout is we need you to do a certain amount of work at this intensity, and you're allowed a certain amount of rest. So you decide how you want to slice that up, but ultimately you need to come away from that workout having a certain amount of quality at a certain intensity, whether that's effort-based, power-based, heart rate-based, or a mixture.
Yeah, that's a really good description of how you can get started on that journey. And that was actually one of my questions that I have noted down about what self-coach listeners can do if they want to take their first steps in this direction of training and being more particular, shall we say, and take these quantitative outputs and inputs into accounts. Is there how should they done? But let's make it even more specific. What you mentioned, the SWOT analysis, is that a good place to start for the self-coached age grouper?
Just in terms of how they would go about that?
Yeah, just in terms of how to start planning their training and then executing that training and being more particular and having that quantitativeness to their training.
Yeah, I think the run is a good example where it's very easy to really start to get a sense of being a bit wiser with the intensity that you're training at. If you've done a couple of running events in the past, or even if you've only done one and you've just done a 5K and you've started getting into triathlon, then you can very easily find on the internet Jack Daniels, what they call VDOT tables, super easy to find. And on that, you can look up what your VDOT score is. And then from that, it will tell you, this is your endurance pace, and this is your threshold pace, and this is your interval pace. And that's a good starting point, and you don't need to necessarily get more accurate than using something such as that. On the bike, if people don't have a power meter, or they don't even own a heart rate monitor, even simplistically, you can find a nearby climb that's a steady incline that's going to take somewhere between 4 and 8 minutes. And, on a reasonably benign day from a weather perspective, just ride up it as hard as you can. And that's a very gross, simplistic mechanism of laying down a benchmark of, is my fitness improving? And at completely the other end of the spectrum, you have lactate testing, critical power testing, where you're doing, multiple measures, in a lab or with a power meter on your bike, and then going away and calculating, a very accurate threshold.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned the VDOT calculator, which is great. And for the bike, if the listener don't have power meters and heart rate monitors, there's a good article on Training Peaks where Andy Coggan, I believe, has overlaid his power zones with RPE, very descriptive RPE zones, so the listeners can use those, and I'll try to find it and link it up. And also, I think Matt Fitzgerald has a great calculator which also has swim, which I think is the critical swim speed that you mentioned.
Yeah, the critical swim speed is easy. That's an easy one. There's various articles on the internet. There's the actual original work by Wakayoshi, where you take a 400 and a 50 time, and you just subtract the 50 time from the 400 time, and then divide it by 350, and that gives you your critical pace. The other way is the more recent terminology of critical swim speed, which is a term used by Paul Newsome at Swim Smooth. And again, that's fairly easy to calculate, because you do a 400 and a 200, and you subtract the 200 from the 400, and you divide by 2, and that gives you your critical pace. Now, the swim's an interesting one in a sense that I think you have to be a little bit wary of getting too wrapped up in training it in the same way that you would train the bike and the run, because I fundamentally do not think that that's the best way to get the best out of your swim. Yes, there is a certain demand to swim regularly and to get some distance in, but the reality is that you're just never going to swim enough as a triathlete to really be driving the aerobic pathways in the same way that a swimmer would be, because you just don't have the time available. So then you really want to start to understand what's the best way for me to improve my swim based on improving my technique, but improving my technique under load. So, not just doing drills, but actually, working on acquiring a better sense of the skill that you have in the water, whether that's using toys or getting feedback from a coach, whether that's, visual or oral, that can help you start to understand what you need to do to sort of better express the fitness that you have in the water.
Yeah, definitely. I think that just getting to a coach swim session once a month or so, and getting that feedback, and then trying to really be present in your sessions, and under load, as you say, apply that technique and really think about what you're doing. That will bring you a long way to both bring up the fitness and the technique at the same time. You don't need to choose between one or the other.
No, you can't separate the two. I mean, a really good example of where you can't really separate the two and understanding what's actually going on within the body is, personally, I really dislike, unless there's a very specific reason, the persistent use of paddles by triathletes. And the reason is that most triathletes have a terrible feel for the water anyway. And add into that, when you race in a triathlon, when you're swimming on other people's feet, your catch is really, you're catching dirty water that's already aerated. So it's even harder to get a good catch, a good feel for the water. So if you put something on your hand that doesn't actually allow you to have a good feel for the water, and it means your arm moves slower through the water at a slower contractile rate than you would typically swim at, then that to me seems completely counterproductive to what you actually need to achieve in swimming. Now, there are certain very specific scenarios where you might use it as a tool, but it's a tool in the same way that, a flathead screwdriver is a tool, or a Phillips head is a tool. It's not something, it's not a crutch.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point that you make, and makes a lot of sense now that you put it that way, definitely. And yes, you are right. You see triathletes, or you can almost recognize the triathletes in the pool just by, do they have paddles on and a pool buoy between their legs all the time or not?
And I think that brings kind of in, you asked me earlier really sort of about, sort of coaching style. And I think that kind of point's an interesting one to bring it back full circle. And really, if you ask me to summarize, the way that I coach, it's really this question of why. I'm not arrogant enough to sit here and say that we shouldn't learn from history, but really, sort of true success and true learning and progression comes from constantly asking, why is this, exercise or movement or thought process relevant? Why am I doing it in relation to my goals, in relation to the course, in relation to my physiology? Why does it work? As a coach, I think it's important to understand, why does this intervention work, or why doesn't it work? So it's constantly asking that why question. Triathlon is an aerobic sport. The majority of what people should be doing is aerobic. And the more you can ask that question of relevancy or specificity, the better the more effective the training that you do is going to be.
Yeah, and I think that's a very good point, and really trying to challenge yourself all the time, both whether it's as a coach or as a self-coach athlete. Not necessarily once you've made a decision and a plan, then don't try to start second guessing it all the time and change things around. But being a bit challenging to yourself and to your decisions in the planning process, and at certain strategic points can be a really good thing. And at trying to find ways that you may do things better than you have been doing. So that brings up another question. Obviously, there are a lot of very large individual variances here, but you mentioned there asking why and knowing why. So have you found any common whys in your coaching of age groupers specifically? Any commonalities in that apply to most of them that age groupers listening to this can take away and apply to their own training?
Yeah, I think there's the commonalities that I've seen between age group athletes and the professional athletes that I've worked with. I think the biggest quality that I see in terms of successful outcomes is being very, very intrinsically motivated. The best athletes that I've worked with, and there's a clear pattern because I do actually, when I start working with people, I do sort of do a questionnaire which looks at intrinsic and extrinsic motivations. And there's a clear pattern and relationship between the ones that are heavily intrinsically motivated for the sense of achievement, the sense of getting the best that they physically want to get out of their body, are the ones that I see the most success with. You combine that with a very open and honest level of communication about how the training is going, how it felt, but also broader picture, trying to avoid compartmentalizing life. And this is probably the one mistake that I see many self-coached athletes make, is they try to compartmentalize their work and their family and their training. And the reality is that there's always washover in terms of stresses or pressures across all of those. And so to sit there and have a really stressful job, come home and go, right, I now need to do a really intense session, goes back to my point about understanding cognitive load. You need, as a coach and as a self-coached athlete, you need to be able to step back a little bit and say, okay, well, how does everything interrelate? Do I really have, the mental and the physical energy to do what I need to do today? Or do I need to, adapt accordingly because my time is limited, or I can't get to the swimming pool, or, I don't have just the sort of the mental bandwidth to do that really hard workout tonight, but I know that I can do it tomorrow. And it's just making those judgment calls and trying to remain objective about the broader, longer picture of, well, in 3 months' time, this is my A race. I'm going to go and finish that Olympic distance triathlon. So really, adapting today is not a deal breaker, but am I trending in the right direction? Does that make sense?
It does. And I want to follow up on that. Where do you draw the line, whether you have it in you to do that hard session tonight or if you should skip it? Let's say it's a swim workout, for example. How many, if you know that you can do a hard set at not quite your maximum potential, but maybe just 2 seconds per 100 meters slower or 2 or 3 seconds slower, is that enough of a decrease in performance that you should maybe skip it altogether and try to do it perfectly the next day if you have more time?
From a bike and a run perspective, I would always encourage athletes to sort of go with a 20-minute rule of, start the workout and sort of give it 20 minutes and really see how you feel after 20 minutes. And you may well find that actually, the intensity of the workout becomes almost meditative and cathartic. So I know that sounds maybe kind of slightly masochistic, but actually the reality is with a lot of elite athletes that they do, when they're doing really hard, so for example, VO2 work, that they do almost go into sort of like a meditative state. And so I would encourage people on the bike and the run to particularly give it 20 minutes. And even in the swim, and that's, I haven't necessarily made that up. That just comes from experience of working with many sort of elite athletes that say, sometimes they're just carrying a lot of fatigue and, they're not feeling it. And then they get in the water or they go for a run and they give it a little bit of time. And it really it's about the 20-minute mark where things start to kind of kick in. On the swim, I'd still say 20 minutes, but I'd encourage people, if you have a workout where you're just struggling to hit your times, to look at the workout and say, okay, well, what am I actually trying to achieve here? If I'm doing 10 hundreds quite hard and I'm just not hitting my times, maybe I break that up into sets of 50s and I give myself enough rest that I can cognitively reset, so that I can hold my stroke together. Because the reality is that what you constantly are chasing after in the swim is being able to focus on holding your technique together under load for the longest period of time. And, if you look at the Daniel Coyle's talent code, there's a piece in there about learning, and he talks about sort of neurological learning. And very simplistically, it breaks down to you need to do something well for a short period of time, and then you need to do it well for a short period of time, at high speed, and then you need to do it well for a short period of time at high speed with more power, and then you can do it well for a long period of time, and then long period of time at high speed, and then long period of time at high speed with more power. And the reality is that many triathletes kind of leap in sort of 2/3 of the way down that process of learning and go, I'm just going to jump in and do some hard 400s, and your stroke falls apart 100 meters into that 400. What you'd be better served doing is doing a bunch of 50s off a very short turnaround that's just enough recovery to allow you to mentally reset.
That's a great answer, really great. And I want to piggyback on that 20-minute rule. I think that you probably meant that includes at least part of the intense part of the workout as well. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah, because I think that I'm definitely not the only one that feels that more often than not, the first interval of a VO2 workout, for example, is almost always the hardest one. So just going into a little bit of a discussion on bike training, because that's one of your fortes, with you also coaching road cyclists and mountain biking, I believe. Do you have any overarching principles when it comes to bike training for your triathletes that you coach?
A couple of aspects in there. I think it's understanding the demands of the racing. So, for you have to sort of bear with me if I talk more in the context of, say, an Ironman or a half Ironman. But I think it's important to pay attention to the little details of, where is this course? If I live in Florida, for argument's sake, and it's pancake flat, and I decide I want to go and do Ironman Nice, which has a gigantic mountain in it with a technical descent, then I need to really try and work out and understand how I prepare for that from, a muscle recruitment perspective. And that may mean that you need to do a certain style of sort of strength-based intervals, that maybe joining a local cycling club and doing some criterium racing is beneficial if they have a road bike as well as a triathlon bike. So it's looking at it very specifically and saying, what are the demands? And the same with the mountain bikers and the cyclists is, I've drilled down to, what are we actually talking about from a torque perspective for the mountain biker, or for the road racer? Are they a ruler? Are they a climber? So a ruler is more somebody that is suited to kind of like a rolling course, a super domestique, somebody that, has a good, decent sprint on them, but isn't an out and out pure sprinter? Or are they sort of more of an overall sort of GC contender, and, they're a climber? And then what are the demands of that for them at the key races that they want to race at? And building a program around that, understanding from a neurological perspective, actually how do you improve efficiency? One of the comments I make regularly with the elite athletes that I work with in relation to the swim is, it's not, their ability to swim fast is really not particularly limited by the size of their engine. You're dealing with folks who are at the very pointy end, physiologically speaking. It's their capacity to express that as efficiently as possible. And so it goes back to this focusing on skill awareness, skill acquisition, and just constantly cycling through that under load. And the same with the cyclist. Is there a particular demand for overcoming anxiety around technical descending? How do we address that? Do they have an issue with riding at really high speeds? Do they need to do certain strength and conditioning work to cope with being really stable on the mountain bike whilst the bike is moving around underneath them? Maybe going a little bit off on a tangent, but I always find it interesting when I hear triathlon coaches, say, you don't need to do any strength and conditioning work. It's a waste of time. And then if you actually look at world-class athletes across multiple sports, they are constantly doing some form of conditioning work, because the reality is you need a stable base to express power from. And, whether that's swimming, biking, or running, you need a stable trunk to express all of that cylinders in the engine that, a really talented athlete has. And so you need to be fitting some conditioning work in.
That's I totally agree. That's a whole different podcast. We could talk for a long time about that, but
indeed,
definitely agree. And that's something that so many triathletes, and we are all busy, of course, and not everybody trains for 20, 15, even 10 hours per week. Most triathletes probably train in the 5 to 7 hours per week range or so. So it may seem counterintuitive to take away from that swim, bike, and run time, but you can. That's the thing. You can always do 5 minutes of a routine, in front of the TV. 5 to 10 minutes of a routine in front of the TV of an evening. If
you're really that committed to what you're wanting to achieve, there's always the opportunity to fit it in. And you make a valid point around the time available to train. You know, maybe some of the things that I'm saying, people are going, well, you know, I'm not, you know, Lionel Sanders, I'm not Leslie Smith, you know, I'm not training lots of hours. I'm training, you know, sort of 6-7 hours a week. And the point I'd make there is then, you know, try to be super consistent with the training that you do. You know, if there's no sense in looking at a training plan that has any sort of periodization in it of, you know, 3 weeks of build and 1 week of recovery, when, you know, you've just told me as a coach, you can only train 7 hours a week. So if you can only train 7 hours a week, why would I give you 5 and then 6 and then 10 and then back to 5? Because you'd spend 3/4 of the month fed up you're not training enough, and 1 week of the month fed up that you can't fit all the training in. You know, just find that consistent balance, keep it enjoyable and keep it varied, and in the main, stay away from that middle ground, because that's the other thing that a lot of athletes make the mistake of, is just doing way too much sort of upper tempo, threshold, low threshold work. And that's super expensive. You know, you can get into the mathematics of why, but it's super expensive to recover from. And there's a reason why, when you look at Steven Seeler's work of world-class cross-country skiers and rowers, that there's this clear evidence of polarized training, because in the main, it's easier to recover from much higher intensity intervals than it is that middle ground. Now, there's a time and a place for that middle ground, but it isn't, you know, 10 of the 12 months of the year.
Yeah, I guess that would come back to the specificity kind of thing, depending on what race you race for.
Yes.
Okay, so we're quickly running out of time. You're doing a great job, by the way, of answering a lot of my questions without me even having to ask them with a lot of mistakes that you see and so on. So that's great. Just one more thing about the bike training. So let's put 2 specific examples here. So first, the more of beginner triathlete, but has done a couple of races and do a few sprints and Olympics and train, let's say 6-7 hours per week. So maybe two rides per week. How would they train, just very generally?
I think the first training session they should do should be predominantly aerobically orientated, so like an endurance ride. But within that endurance ride, I'd encourage them to really work at a variety of different cadences. You know, this is a whole other separate debate about, you know, low cadence riding, and not to get into a huge debate about it, but I don't agree with this idea that you need to noodle around at sort of 50, 60 RPM all the time. Again, there's context. You know, it's a training tool. It has its place, but if you're trying to improve the body's ability to express fitness, then you want to learn for your body to operate at different muscle contractile rates. So, you know, riding rolling terrain and riding at different cadences and keeping the intensity predominantly aerobic. What is that when I say aerobic? Somewhere between sort of 3.5 and 5 out of 10. Then that would be a good starting point. And the second session would be maybe where you might do some very short, hard intervals, somewhere between maybe 8 and 16 minutes of total work. And you would slice that up on a 2-to-1, you know, ratio. So if you're doing, you know, 8 minutes of work, you get 4 minutes of recovery. And you can then slice that up as you like.
Fantastic. There's a great template, and of course we know that well, you've said it many times already that it depends on the athlete and the goal and so on and so forth. Yes. But knowing my listeners, for a lot of them, like, even this is going to be a lot better than just shooting in the dark and not really knowing. So there is a time and a place for templates, because not everybody is ready to invest in a coach. So thank you for that. And on the other end of the spectrum, what would you do for somebody like Lionel Sanders, a pro and one of the best at it, by the way, in Ironman racing? how would they train like on the bike?
There's obviously more sessions, and the numbers are larger, but the principles are the same. We're trying to ensure that there is a resilience against neuromuscular fatigue, and there is a high level of fitness. In December last year, when Lionel and I sat down face to face and said, okay, where do we need to be by about this time next year? We laid out a sort of path of progression, and a bit like a colouring in book. I sort of put the picture there, and then it was Lionel's job to go away and colour it in, based on what he understands of his body, and what I know from both sort of science and evidence in the field of this is what you need to do to raise your VO2 or raise your threshold, and do it in a way that you can recover from it as effectively as possible. So that idea of slicing up certain work, I haven't made that up, but there's a piece of work by Stephen Seeler around interval training, and it's readily available on the internet. And he's written a follow-up piece just this week about quality of work and work-rest ratios. And he, working with really good athletes, he talks about 4 by 4 minutes or 4 by 8 or 4 by sort of 12 to 16 minutes of work at decreasing levels of intensity that are still very high. And for triathletes, I looked at that and I said, well, this is great, but for triathletes with 3 sports, there's an increased cognitive demand. So I said, okay, well, with these workouts, we know what we're trying to achieve. We know what the work-rest ratio should be. But if you put it on the athlete and say, look, if you're feeling great today, go do 4 by 4 minutes with 2 minutes recovery. But if you're not feeling great today and you still know you need to do 16 minutes of work, then slice it up differently. Now, if you feel like a rock star, you might do that first interval as sort of 6-7 minutes, and then the rest will be sort of 3 minutes, 2 minutes, and 1 minute. And that seems to have worked really well, whether it's Lionel or whether it's an age group athlete. But just putting that autonomy on them to make a smart decision around just how cognitively demanding they make the workout has allowed Lionel and other athletes to just get the best out of the workout. So principles are the same. It's just the numbers are obviously larger, which anybody that's seen his Strava would agree.
Yeah, I'll try to link to that Strava profile in the show notes as well. And yes, thank you again. That was a very good breakdown. And I think if there's only one thing that you should remember from this interview, then probably this about being flexible, and maybe you're not feeling that great, but you can try to slice it up a bit. And if it's not your day at all, then maybe skip that workout and do it another day. But trying to be flexible and keeping the main principles of what you're trying to achieve in mind all the time. So this has been hugely beneficial, I think. So let's just quickly roll into 3 rapid fire questions, starting with what's your favorite book, blog, or resource related to triathlon?
It's actually not related to triathlon, but it is related to coaching. And, at the moment, I'm reading a book called Conscious Coaching by Brett Bartholomew.
You're kidding me. I'm reading that as well.
Brett's a superb guy, great book. And there's a whole bunch of other sort of similar books. But that's I'm enjoying that at the moment. And favorite piece of gear or equipment, you ask me. I mean, that's an interesting one. I guess it comes back to, if you're not measuring, you're not managing. But the reality is I don't have a particular favorite piece of equipment. I certainly think that, if you're doing some one-to-one work as a coach and you're looking at people swimming, that, a GoPro is almost a prerequisite, because whilst you can see things with the human eye, sometimes the ability to go back and review, and even for an age grouper that doesn't have, that kind of resource, many phones nowadays are somewhat waterproof, getting just even a brief clip of what you're doing under the water to to understand the difference between what you think you're doing and what's actually happening, can be key. So it'd probably be a camera would be
great,
the most valid piece of equipment. And then I think the last question you asked me.
I didn't ask it yet, but I've sent it to you. So.
Yeah, you sent it to me. Yeah, so I'm just kind of like wanting to make sure I get those answered for you. You said, what's a personal habit that's helped me achieve success? I think it goes back to learning, just constantly learning and trying to make better and better informed decisions. A wise manager once said to me, if you think you know it all, then quit your job, because you don't.
Yeah.
Simple as that.
Perfect. Okay, David, this has been absolutely great. I learned a ton, and I think that the listeners will too. Thank you again for coming on the show. Where can the listeners find out more about you and connect with you?
There's a little bit of my website is not sort of full of blogs and all sorts of things, but I'm on Twitter as Coach Tilbers, and my website's tilburydavis.com, and I'm on Instagram as well.
Right. Thank you so much. This has been David Tilbury-Davis. Thank you again, David, for coming on the show.
Thanks, Michael.
I just have one follow-up item before signing out for today, and that is the paper by Steven Seiler that we mentioned in the interview, which is on the topic of what is the most demanding high-intensity interval session. And I'll link to this paper in the show notes so that if you're interested in the details, you can go there and have a look. That's triathlonshow.com. But just some key points here to make from the paper if you're in a hurry and you want the cliff notes. How demanding a session is perceived as depends on the work intensity, accumulated work duration, and the work to rest ratio, as well as the acute intensity. And a fascinating Swedish study from way back in the 60s came to the conclusion that if you perform a workout at a power or pace that would take you to exhaustion within 10 minutes or so when performed as a time trial, but you break that work up into work to rest blocks with a constant 1-to-1 ratio, but different durations. So for example, 1 minute work, 1 minute rest, or 2 minutes work, 2 minute rest, and so on. You will identify a breaking point that happens between that 1 minute and 2 minute work durations, where a 1 minute sustaining that 1-to-1 work duration or 1 minute work, 1 minute rest is sustainable for a whole hour. So that's pretty amazing. But when you increase the duration of work bouts and increase the rest durations to 2 minutes, even though the same work rest ratio and the same accumulated work is in place, it becomes increasingly hard, almost exponentially harder to sustain that. And you see the physiological responses as well of that harder effort. And another interesting piece from this paper is a reference to one of Seiler's own studies with physiological and perceived effort data on over 1,400 individual high-intensity interval training sessions performed by 63 subjects over 12 weeks. These sessions were always one of 3 prescriptions, 4 by 4 minutes, 4 by 8 minutes, or 4 by 16 minutes prescribed as maximal session effort workouts. And the data showed that by a landslide, the hardest perceived workouts were the ones with the 4 by 4 minute work durations. And they had, for example, the percent of sessions with a session RPE of 9 to 10 on that session RPE scale, which goes to 10 as maximum, was 32% for the 4 by 4 minute session, and only 7.8% for the 4 by 8 minute session, and 5.3% for the 4 by 16 minute session. But Seiler makes a good point on that data, leading them to conclude that effort and exertion are different constructs, and acute exertion seems to be strongly driven by acute work intensity, whereas effort can be seen as the integral of exertion and time. And I'll leave it at that and not talk any more about this. But again, go to the show notes on thattriathlonshow.com, and you can find that and all the things that we talked about with David as well. The next episode will come out this Thursday as usual. We will have Gail Bernhardt, an Olympic coach, and with her, but she's also coached a lot of age groupers. And we'll talk triathlon training for beginners. As I promised a couple of episodes ago, we'll have more content for beginners as well going forward. And Gail is an expert in that field, so that will be exciting. Please send me feedback and questions and topic and guest requests to michael@scientifictriathlon.com. That's Michael with a K. Or tweet me. My handle is @SciTriat. That's it for today's episode. See you on Thursday. And in the meantime, keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.